one of the most alarming trends that we've been covering over the past few years has been the use of the web to spread misinformation and the hacking of elections. And we're well aware of the way social media platforms were hijacked in 2016 to disrupt the US elections, and the scandal over Cambridge Analytica, and the harvesting of Facebook to micro-target voters. But last week's US election was in many ways, I think, a turning point for some of these platforms and for social media. There's plenty of research that shows that growing numbers of people get their news from these big platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc. So they really do play a critical role in shaping our political discourse and our opinions. But with that enormous power comes great responsibility. And it does feel like some of these platforms are finally coming to terms with that idea in a way that perhaps they didn't last time around. And they have been taking steps to create content policies, to moderate content that's posted on their platforms, to label posts that contain misinformation, defamation, incitements to violence, hate speech, etc. Now, this is all, it couldn't be more topical because obviously we are now in the midst of apparently a disputed election result, although it doesn't seem that way. But quite how this plays out with Donald Trump over the coming days is not clear. And it is a potentially messy situation. But either way, this is not a problem that's going to go away, unfortunately. In fact, far from it, because advances in artificial intelligence are creating powerful new technologies of political manipulation. Not just deepfakes or doctored videos, but fake AI text and a host of other tools which can confuse and adjust the way that people see the world. We've written quite a bit about this over the past few years. So in our next session, we're going to take a deep dive into the technologies of political manipulation and its implications for our democracies and our societies. So I'd now like to hand over to Ellie Zolfagharifard, who is going to introduce our next speaker to talk about some of these issues. Thanks. Over to you, Ellie.
Thank you, Robin. So this morning I have the pleasure of speaking to the wonderful Nina Schick, who is a political broadcaster and an expert in how tech and AI are reshaping politics. Just 2 years ago, Nina was advising the now President-elect Joe Biden on deepfakes, and she's recently released a book called Deepfakes, which is essentially about how the age of information has become the age of disinformation. As Robin said, in the aftermath of the US election, I think Nina's expertise is now more crucial than ever. So thank you, Nina, very much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
I think it might be useful to start right from the top. There's various definitions flying around on deepfakes, but what exactly do you mean when you describe something as a deepfake?
A deepfake is essentially a type of synthetic media. And what synthetic media is a piece of media. It can be audio, it can be an image, it can be text, it can be a piece of any type of media that's been generated by AI. And the ability of AI to do this, manipulate or generate media completely from scratch, is very nascent. It's only been around for about 3 years, and it's been powered by the revolution in data and the ability of computers to churn through it all. And it is bear saying right from the outset that synthetic media is going to have many commercially viable applications, but it will also become a weapon of mis and disinformation. And when synthetic media is used in this way, that's what I define as a deepfake. So a deepfake is the malicious use of synthetic media, that is a piece of fake media that has been manipulated or generated by artificial intelligence.
Thank you. That's useful because I think many of us think of synthetic media. We think about those face swapping apps and maybe those fun YouTubes where you see Jim Carrey swapped with Al Pacino in Scarface. But can you give me a recent example of a deepfake that you've seen that was particularly disturbing?
So the first and most malicious use case of deepfakes has been in non-consensual pornography against women. And this is actually where they first started emerging, when the bleeding kind of cutting edge research breakthroughs in the AI research community started filtering through to a broader audience. They emerged on Reddit, where an anonymous user kind of took some open source AI platforms and tools and decided to make these fake AI manipulated non-consensual pornographic videos. They targeted at their inception celebrities, but since then, since they first emerged a few years ago, that technology has been proliferating to make non-consensual porn of normal women and very disturbingly also of minors. So there is no doubt that the first malicious use case of this AI generated fake media has been in non-consensual porn against women, but increasingly it's starting to filter through also into fraud and politics.
And I guess we've seen a lot of that in the past 2 weeks. I'd like to ask you about Biden, because I know just 2 years ago you were advising the now president-elect. I'm fascinated to know how seriously you think he takes the issue of deepfakes and misinformation, and is he, in your view, alarmed by its potential?
So the first thing to say is that deepfakes, so AI generated fake media, are simply the latest evolving threat in what has become an increasingly dangerous and untrustworthy information ecosystem. And over the past 10 years, we've seen the scale of mis and disinformation at a level that has been completely unprecedented. When I was advising Biden, he was a part of a group of global leaders that I was advising on how disinformation would evolve in the future. And the very reason that group was brought together was to look at election interference and disinformation. So I absolutely think the president-elect understands that the corroding information ecosystem and the scale and potency of disinformation, including disinformation that increasingly will be powered by AI in the future, is something that is a tremendous national security threat. And I think the other comment I'd make about that is that he himself, over the past year, as he's been running for president, has become a target of vicious disinformation. He himself has been in many kind of manipulated or edited video clips, and even those in his family, most importantly, his son, Hunter Biden, has been the victim of a pretty malicious disinformation campaign. So I would say, yes, he understands the problem from both a conceptual, political, geopolitical perspective, but also as somebody who's been personally targeted by disinformation.
Yeah, I mean, what could someone like Biden in his position do to help society tackle deepfakes, not just the sophisticated type of deepfakes, but some of the more amateurish attempts at deepfakes, which you call cheap fakes in your book, which are still as damaging? What's something that policymakers might be able to do on this?
Yeah, so over the past 10 years, we've seen how manipulated, miscontextualized, edited images and video that don't have any kind of AI even involved, so-called cheap fakes, have been devastatingly effective. And in places such as in Myanmar, for example, they've even been used to incite genocide. So I think that every political leader needs to understand that the information ecosystem itself is corroding and is becoming increasingly dangerous and is swaying political events. You see that playing out right now in the United States, where this narrative, which is based on zero evidence that somehow there has been widespread voting fraud and manipulation in the election, is a reason as to why President Trump should not concede the election. So I think the number one thing that policymakers have to think about is, rather than getting caught up in the polarizing riptides of this corroding information ecosystem itself, is thinking about, how do we actually fix the architecture of the information ecosystem? What are the tech solutions we can embed into the architecture of this information ecosystem to make sure that we can somehow filter the information that's good and authentic from that's increasingly going to become synthetic or is mis and disinformation?
Yeah, I guess there are some tech solutions out there, but you would think with the billions of dollars that some of these tech companies have to tackle the problem, they could have rolled something out ahead of the election. Do you think that they've failed in their responsibility, or should they be doing more in this area?
I think the problem is so big that it can't fall to the tech companies alone to try and solve it. What has been interesting is that they have stepped up their efforts this year, both in regards to COVID as well as the US election. So we have seen that it is not as difficult as the tech companies have said in the past to remove or fact check or mitigate the spread of damaging and bad information. But ultimately, I think that this is something that can only be solved by taking a networked approach. So by that, I mean the tech companies have to work with policymakers, who in turn have to work with civil society. This is not a problem that the tech companies can solve by themselves.
Are you seeing any good examples of this that other people could kind of copy or perhaps take inspiration from? Are there any collaborations that we should be looking towards?
There are certain collaborative efforts emerging, and they happen to be industry-led. So with regards to the various tech solutions, one solution is to look at the provenance of information. So to prove that any information is authentic from its inception. And this is, of course, a very handy tool for all journalists or human rights activists to show that any media that's recorded on your device is actually authentic, because in a world where anything can be faked, everything can also be dismissed as fake. So the idea of embedding into the hardware of your devices authenticity, proving technology is something that Adobe has started in the Content Authenticity Initiative, where it teams up with Qualcomm, the chip maker, TruePic, and Twitter. And this coalition is basically building devices where you can prove the authenticity of media. But that's, of course, only one tiny slice of the solution, because aside from building provenance architecture, you can also think about building detection software to detect fakes. So ultimately, I think you are starting to see some coalitions coming together, but because the problem itself is so vast, they're only tackling small pieces of the pie.
Yeah. Are we at the point that if the president wanted, for instance, to create a deep fake showing some sort of electoral fraud, he could do so easily, and that it would go viral very quickly? Is the technology advanced enough for that, or is it still in the era of cheap fakes?
The technology is advanced enough to do that, but for the moment, it would still need perhaps more effort and resources than the president should care to expend, because what we've already seen is that cheap fakes, these manipulations that have nothing to do with AI, are already very, very effective. And you've already seen over the past week how videos of a cameraman moving his equipment around has been gone viral on social media as though it was evidence of a worker removing ballots from the voting center. So there isn't even a need for deep fakery right now, when the kind of cheap fakery around the election have already been pretty devastating and gone viral on social media. But when the barriers to entry come down, because remember, this technology has only been around for about 2.5 years, and is becoming increasingly accessible and increasingly sophisticated. So when the barriers to entry come down to the extent where anybody can make deep fakes using just a smartphone app, it's inevitable that we're going to start to see them proliferating. Some experts who I've spoken to when I was researching my book think that in 5 to 7 years' time, 90% of video content online is going to be synthetic. So there is no doubt in my mind that the future is synthetic, and that future is coming very quickly. It might be 1 or 2 or 3 or even 4 years before they're ubiquitous, but ubiquitous they will be.
That's a remarkable statistic. What can we do as individuals to guard ourselves against deepfakes, misinformation, disinformation, if that is going to be the huge volume of content that we'll consume in 5 to 7 years?
We have to be critical without becoming cynical, because there's one of the perverse things about deepfakes is that it augments something called the liar's dividend, because the more you understand that we're entering an era where seeing is no longer believing, in the sense that any media, including video, which until now we've pretty much seen as an extension of our own perception. This is why video evidence is seen as so powerful, unless it's in the movies, which we understand has been manipulated or tweaked, but the kind of special effects you see in movies cost multi-million dollars to create, teams of special FX artists. So it's not accessible to a broad audience. But what AI is going to do is going to democratize those level kind of special effects to almost anyone, where, you know, even a YouTuber can make, using free AI generating software, the same kind of video that is only in the domain of a Hollywood studio today. So as we understand that we're entering a world where seeing is no longer believing, the perversity of deepfakes is that actually in a world where anything can be faked, everything can also be denied. So even authentic media then can be decried as fake. So we simply start to lose our grasp on what is real or what is not real. So it is important that we understand that until deepfakes become ubiquitous, the first impact it might have is augmenting the liar's dividend, in the sense that bad actors will be able to avoid accountability, because if there is anything incriminating through authentic media, they'll be able to say, well, that's a deepfake or that's fake. So the number one thing is to be critical, but without becoming cynical, and really understanding that information can be manipulated in this way, not only in the political domain, but increasingly will also be used against individuals and things such as fraud. And that's where deepfake is already starting to be used.
Oh yeah, I mean, in the very worst case scenario, with the technology we have today, rather than how it will evolve, what is what sort of situation could arise?
So I think the most harmful use case of deepfakes right now is in this augmentation of the liar's dividend when it comes to politics. So something authentic emerges, and then it's decried as being a deepfake. And one of the very interesting things I noticed earlier this year was that when the George Floyd video came out, the horrific video where, you know, this man basically was suffocated to death over almost 9 minutes. It united the entire United States in this spontaneous kind of protest, and which spread all across the world. At the time, I was just sending off the manuscript for my book, and I thought it's not going to be long, given the rising ability of deepfake technology, until a video like this is decried as being inauthentic. But even I was surprised at how quickly that happened. Barely a month had gone by before an African-American candidate standing for the House as a verified Republican candidate, Dr. Winnie Hartstrong, so a PhD holding candidate standing for public office, released a 24-page document in which she said the entire George Floyd video was a hoax and it was a deep fake, and that the man who was playing George Floyd in the video was actually a retired NBA player. So this was fairly contained. It didn't go viral, but this wasn't on some bizarre right-wing corner of the internet. This was, as I already mentioned, a PhD holding candidate standing for public office making such claims. And I think the first and most devastating impact of this corroding information ecosystem that we see playing out right now is the inability to distinguish fact from fiction. You saw it with kind of this bizarre claims about the deepfake George Floyd video being a deepfake hoax, but you see it playing out right now with the US election. We have quite a few months to go before Joe Biden, the president-elect, is inaugurated, and yet the president still has not conceded defeat. And this narrative that he's been seeding since the beginning of the year, that this election has been rigged and stolen, is gathering momentum. I think this is the dangerous disinformation to follow over the next few weeks and months to see how that develops.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in 2016, when you were analysing the election then, did you see the kernels of this evolving, how this will play out again in 4 years' time? and how was it different back then?
Well, the interesting thing about 2016 was that the big story then was all about Russian foreign intervention in the US election. And what is fascinating is that even though that has now been established by all Western military intelligence agencies, and also been established by a bipartisan Senate committee, the fact that Russia intervened in the 2016 election in favor of Donald Trump, that statement has become a completely partisan one, right? So on one side, there people see influence of Russia everywhere, even where it doesn't exist, and on the other, there's simply a denial that Russia intervened at all. So that was all about 2016, and in 2020, however, even though people have been thinking, oh, is there going to be a lot of foreign influence? And there have been foreign actors trying to intervene in the election. The biggest story of 2020 is much more about the domestic disinformation threat, and specifically the disinformation that's been emanating from the White House itself with regards to Donald Trump's claims of a stolen election, of which there is still no evidence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In your book, it's very interesting that you predict that if Trump doesn't win, he won't accept the result. And that was months before the election happened. Given your form, and this is the final question, I was wondering if you could give a prediction for the next 2 decades. I know you say that deepfakes will be ubiquitous, but how do you think in 20 years' time we'll be dealing with it?
I think that my first prediction is going to be that the future is synthetic, in the sense that all media that we interact with, that we consume, that we produce is increasingly going to be generated by AI. That isn't all going to be bad. It's going to be amazing for creativity. You know, if you're a YouTuber and you can make the same kind of visual effects that a Hollywood studio can do, massive boon for creatives. But my second prediction would be is that our perception of the world is increasingly going to be shaped by these synthetic media pieces that we interact with. So I think that any kind of unified world, any kind of unity in society is probably going to splinter even more as we become increasingly kind of polarized and go into our own silos of what is truth and what is reality. So I think there's a deep philosophical question here in terms of how citizens are going to engage with what they think is happening and what is truth and what is reality.
Is there hope, though, out there for us? Is there light at the end of this dystopian tunnel?
Absolutely. I think there are many solutions. There are many kind of tech solutions. There are many society-led solutions. It's just that the changes in our information ecosystem have happened so quickly over the past 30 years. We've had the internet, the smartphone, social media. Now we have the age of synthetic media coming upon us. And every time in history, if you look at huge changes in the way that humans have communicated due to technology. For example, the invention of the printing press. It's taken some time for society to catch up. There were 400 years between the invention of the printing press to the birth of modern photography. And yet all of these changes to our information ecosystem and all the associated technologies have all come onto us in the past 30 years. So it's going to take a little bit of time for society to catch up, but I think we will.
I hope so. As you say, it's really changed so quickly, and we haven't really stopped to take stock of how it's damaged our information ecosystem. So I would recommend anyone to read Nina's book. It's really fascinating. And thank you, Nina, for taking time to talk to us today.
Thank you.